Thank you. Though we are strangers to one another, I can think of two things we share in common. First, we all like the planet we live on. And second, not one of us is very well equipped to live on a different planet. Yet that is how scientists describe Earth, a different planet, if we don't begin slashing carbon very soon. Mark Linus put it bluntly in an article he wrote recently. He said, if we go on emitting greenhouse gases at anything like the current rate, most of the surface of the globe will be rendered uninhabitable within the lifetimes of most readers of this article. 10 days ago, the mayor of New York City addressed a UN climate conference and said that curbing global warming was just as important as stopping nuclear proliferation and terrorism. As Mayor Bloomberg put it, terrorists kill people. Weapons of mass destruction have the potential to kill enormous numbers of people. Global warming long-term has the potential to kill everybody. The fact we must face is that no one on this planet is going to be unaffected by climate change as time goes on. Our collective future hinges on our response today. As individuals, we can choose one of two paths. We can either put our heads in the sand and pretend nothing is happening, or we can each find our own role in this crisis. Unfortunately, the sheer scope and horror of global warming causes most people to choose the former path, living day to day as if no threat is looming in their future. The purpose of my talk this evening is to bring climate crisis to a conceptual level that ordinary citizens can act on. It is often said that throughout history, ordinary people have considered it their responsibility to do something extraordinary. The time we live in calls us all to do something extraordinary, mobilize a nation to save a planet. I would like to start by describing the urgency we face and our government's colossal failure to address carbon pollution. I will then turn to a legal principle that I hope can catalyze the kind of paradigm shift needed to confront this crisis. And I will leave you with a call to citizenship that I hope you can take back to your homes, your schools, your churches, and your workplaces. Let's start with the global view of the problem. I present this picture even though many people are informed about global warming. However, even those well-informed people are not internalizing the urgency we now face. It is an urgency that puts a premium on every single day that passes. Carbon levels in the atmosphere are now higher than they have been for 650,000 years. Every day, humans release another 70 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere. The world's carbon emissions are rising 3 times as fast as they did in the 1990s, increasing by about 3% every year. Once in the atmosphere, carbon persists for 100 to 1,000 years. This means generations to come will be trapped under the greenhouse roof of our own making. 6 months ago, leading climate scientists issued a report concluding that Earth is in their words, imminent peril. Scientists have said that if we don't curb carbon now, humanity will be living on a transformed planet. Global warming threatens to destroy all major planetary fixtures, including the polar ice sheets, Greenland, the coral reefs, and the Amazon forest. As the Washington Post said, for scientists, global warming is a disaster movie, its opening scene set at the poles of the Earth. The epic has already started, and it's not fiction. The Earth has already heated 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial average temperatures. And because of the carbon already in the atmosphere, a total 2 degrees Celsius rise is now inevitable. That 2-degree rise is what scientists consider to be the threshold of catastrophic runaway heating. Exceeding this would make it warmer on Earth than it has been for 500,000 years, and to quote one leading scientist, many things could become unstoppable. The UN, the United Nations, projects that this irrevocable 2 degrees Celsius rise will put up to 30% of plant and animal species at extinction. Species of all sorts are already beginning to migrate to the poles and seeking out higher latitudes in search of cooler temperatures. Coral reefs worldwide are bleaching and dying. Climate heating is driving relentless drought in Australia and the Southwest. It's shrinking the Great Lakes reservoirs in the West and Lake Chad in Africa. It's causing severe water shortages in Tibet and Tennessee, yet floods in Texas and Jakarta, mega fires in California, Greece, and Idaho, and killer hurricanes in New Orleans and Honduras. Mosquito-borne illness is sickening people in high-elevation places that have never seen tropical disease before. In the forests of British Columbia, beetle infestations have killed millions of acres of trees, And U.S. foresters now predict that every large, mature, lodgepole pine forest in Colorado and southern Wyoming will be dead within 5 years. Climate change is delivering heat waves that killed 32,000 people in Europe in 2003 and sent thousands of Americans to cooling centers in 2006 and 2007. It's spiking summer temperatures in Death Valley to 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's bringing New York City 72 degrees Fahrenheit weather in the middle of the winter. As one UN scientist put it, 10 years ago we were talking about these impacts affecting our children and grandchildren. Now they're happening to us. Sea levels are rising. The UN has warned nations to prepare for up to a 2-foot sea level rise by century's end. But more recently assembled scientific data indicates that there is accelerated loss of ice far outpacing even the most pessimistic UN projections. A year ago, scientists made a stunning prediction that the Arctic might be free of summer ice by 2040. More recently, some have revised that prediction to 2012. Last month, the head of the UN panel climate team asked scientists to look at what he considered the frightening possibility that ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica could melt rapidly at the same time. Melting of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets would add up to a sea level rise of 10 or more meters. A 10-meter rise would flood about 25% of the United States population. If the entire Antarctic ice sheet in Greenland melt, the world faces a sea level rise of about 80 meters. As climate disaster strikes various areas, people move in desperate search of survival resources. The UN has alerted nations to prepare for 50 million environmental refugees by 2010. A World Security Report co-authored by former head of the CIA, a former chief of staff, a former deputy secretary of defense, and others describes the scenario of a 2.6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature by 2040. In their words, nations around the world will be overwhelmed by the scale of change. The social consequences range from increased religious fervor to outright chaos. The darkest outlook comes from James Lovelock, long considered a prophet of climate science. He predicts by the end of the century, most of Earth's current population of 6.6 billion people will be wiped out, leaving only 500 million hanging on at the far latitudes of the planet. We only hope he is dead wrong. Many of you might be wondering about the climate skeptics. If you follow their trail, you will find that most are paid by industry-funded think tanks to spread confusion. The reality is, anyone still in denial probably wants to be in denial. They are best left ignored. For quite some time, the question has not been whether global warming is occurring. The question is whether we will cut our carbon emissions in time to prevent runaway heating. NASA scientist James Hansen, widely considered the world's preeminent climate scientist, wrote just days ago, "We are on the hairy edge." There's no doubt humanity is in for some severe climate punishment already, but the consequences will be unthinkably worse if we don't slash emissions now. If we continue on the present course, the UN projects a possible temperature rise of 6.1 degrees Celsius, that's about 11 degrees Fahrenheit, by century's end. We are rapidly approaching a climate tripwire, a point of no return that climate scientists call the tipping point. At such point, our enormous carbon pollution could kick in positive feedbacks in nature that are capable of unraveling the planet's climate system, causing runaway heating despite any subsequent carbon reductions by humanity. Scientists have identified several dangerous feedbacks. One is the albedo flip. When ice melts and turns to water, it causes further heating because water absorbs heat while ice reflects heat. So melting begets more melting. Another feedback is the failure of Earth's natural sinks to absorb more carbon to compensate for our pollution. The Amazon rainforest is drying and burning, releasing more carbon than its remaining vegetation can absorb. The oceans are becoming saturated with carbon. In short, these places are on the verge of becoming sources of carbon rather than sinks. Another feedback result is from the vast expanses of permafrost melting up in Siberia and Alaska. This has the capacity to release enormous amounts of carbon and methane, a scenario described by one climate science writer as an atmospheric tsunami. These feedbacks lead us closer to a precipice. Even 2 years ago, it was thought that we might have 8 to 10 years before the tipping point, but more recent data shows We are on its doorstep now. To quote a leading study, Earth is perilously close to dramatic climate change that could run out of our control. The head of the UN's climate panel recently told the world, what we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. This is the defining moment. 2 years. That deadline still hasn't registered with most Americans. The United States continues to produce nearly 30% of the world's carbon emissions. Look around. Our society is nowhere near decarbonizing. Many people seem happily oblivious to this global catastrophe, perhaps because it seems more like science fiction than reality. It seems the more dire the environmental issue, the less likely it is to be taken seriously in the United States of America. So let's review the big picture. We face a problem that is unprecedented in terms of its consequences, a problem caused by virtually everyone on Earth, a problem that to solve requires us to overhaul our sectors and our lifestyles, and as if that were not enough, a problem that requires us to act before nature passes a critical tipping point looming right in front of us. Climate thinkers agree. Nothing less than a massive global effort surpassing the scale of World War II can provide hope of stabilizing climate at this point. But this is no time to get discouraged. We must save despair for better times. We have tremendous ability to mount an atmospheric defense effort. The biggest limiting force is our imagination of what is possible. We must remember the great wartime mobilization of World War II. When we hear auto companies today complain that they need 12 years just to come into higher fuel efficiency standards, remember the automobile industry suspended car making for 3 years just so they could make defense vehicles in World War II. All manufacturing was re-geared to the war effort. A toy company made compasses, a corset manufacturer produced grenade belts, the financial world sold war bonds, states lowered their speed limit to conserve gas, communities planted victory gardens to grow food locally so that commercial supplies could be sent to the troops. Consumers made do with the bare minimum. Speakers bureaus formed in cities across the country, drawing 100,000 volunteers. These victory speakers, as they were called, were key to mobilizing the nation in a very short time. They would give 5-minute speeches at theaters, clubs, town hall schools, any forum they could find to explain the nature of the threat and the need for citizen action. Victory speakers were not chosen for their outstanding oratory skills, but rather they were the trusted and familiar voices in the community, the banker, the carpenter, the mother, the school teacher. People did not just sit by, they took initiative, and their leaders inspired urgent action. As President Roosevelt said, "Let no man say it cannot be done. Speed will save lives. Speed will save this nation which is in peril. Speed will save our civilization. Slowness has never been an American characteristic." Generations later, how is this same country responding to climate crisis? The reality today is that most Americans are too busy to make time for global warming. Where are the parents, for example? We are so consumed with taking our children to piano lessons and soccer games that we don't stop to think to how our children will fare in 2040 if we leave them a world of runaway heating where water and food supplies will be scarce and relentless natural disasters will strike the areas they live in. By living out the American dream today, we are essentially signing our own children up for a draft of their lifetimes in an unending war for survival. Only this war will be the scariest because it has no end, not even for their descendants. It doesn't matter that we are good, devoted parents who aren't that interested in global warming. Nature won't consider our children conscientious objectors to climate crisis. To be sure, there are some Americans responding with small changes in their lives. They ride the bus more often, they refuse to buy bottled water, they purchase locally grown food, and they turn off the lights. These people are very important models, but national defense cannot be put on the backs of a few good soldiers. Most of those concerned citizens are doing nothing to enlist the rest of society in climate defense. There are few victory speakers for climate crisis. Small progress can give us a dangerous sense of security. Climate defense entails carbon math. We lose this effort if we can't get our total planetary carbon levels down in time before the tipping point. Each day that passes, our narrow window of opportunity closes that much more. Here is the hopeful part. We have the human imagination, the resources, the legal tools, and the bureaucracy to cut carbon. We can do so without harming our citizens. In fact, many of the changes would vastly improve the American quality of life. But this is clearly a task for our government. And that's exactly why we have government, to address broad threats to society and organize a response. We have thousands of agencies, in fact, more than any other nation in the world. If every one of them made global warming a top priority, we might stand a chance of meeting this challenge head on. But all of our regulatory authority and taxpayer money is locked up in government. We need those resources to be put to use immediately in curbing carbon. In World War II, new agencies and commissions sprang up overnight to amass a national defense effort. Looking back, Hurricane Katrina was the Pearl Harbor of climate crisis. Yet do you see mayors and city councils and county commissioners and Congress and the legislatures and the president convening task forces and getting up early and working late to address this crisis? No. In fact, our government is driving this country towards runaway greenhouse gas emissions. County commissioners are approving trophy home subdivisions and destination resorts as if global warming didn't exist. State environmental agencies are approving air permits as if global warming didn't exist. The Forest Service is approving huge timber sales, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is permitting coal-fired plants and expanding mountaintop coal mining. There presently exists a deep gulf between what we should be doing and what we are doing. We must remember that in a system of democracy, citizens do hold the levers of government. Government will act if citizens demand it, but our leaders will not act if citizens don't demand them to. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." The heart of the problem is this. Americans seem to have lost their understanding that government is obligated to protect their natural resources. And when the public loses its sense of government responsibility, believe me, government leaders quickly lose their sense of responsibility towards the public. There's no better evidence of this than the position taken by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency with respect to climate change. The EPA is the only agency charged by Congress to protect the air and the atmosphere. Yet the agency is spending all of its time and talent and taxpayer money to resist protecting the atmosphere. The agency even sent its lawyers all the way up to the United States Supreme Court to argue that EPA did not have to regulate carbon dioxide pollution. The lawyers characterized protection of the atmosphere as a political choice and claimed that the agency has the discretion to permit pollution by the fossil fuel and automobile industries. No matter that this legalized pollution threatens to destroy the climate stability that has supported human civilization for the last 12,000 years. EPA lost that case, but it still hasn't passed rules regulating carbon dioxide, and now it's doing everything in its power to prevent California from passing standards for new automobiles. It's as if our home is on fire, there's 20 fire trucks in the driveway with hoses drawn, and the fire chief claims discretion to sit idle and watch our house burn down. Unless we Americans quickly gain a fierce sense that our leaders are responsible for protecting our atmosphere, we won't force them to take the bold action necessary within that narrow 2-year window of time we have left. Our leaders will continue to fiddle while this country is pulled over a dangerous tipping point into a world of runaway heating. In order to solve the problem, we must understand its cause. How have Americans lost sight of their government's basic obligation to protect crucial natural resources? Ironically, the explanation may lie in an unintended consequence of our modern environmental laws. In the 1970s, at the height of the environmental movement, Congress passed an ambitious set of environmental statutes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and others. These statutes give us more environmental law than any other nation on earth. They provide tremendous authority to federal, state, and local agencies to control just about any environmental harm you can think of. The problem is that, along with this authority, these laws also gave discretion to agencies to permit the very pollution or land destruction that the statutes were designed to prevent. Of course, the permit systems were never intended to subvert the goals of environmental statutes. But the majority of agencies now spend nearly all of their resources to permit rather than prohibit environmental destruction. They've used their discretion to enshrine a permit system that inevitably sinks the statutory goals. So whether you're talking about the U.S. EPA or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or a state water agency or a city planning agency, most are simply not saying no. And now the overarching mindset of most agencies is that permits are there to be granted. Because of these permit systems, society has lapsed into assuming that government must have nearly unbridled discretion to allow destruction of our natural assets. And courts aggravate this problem because they fail to examine whether the agency decision is politicized. They operate on the false assumption that all agency decisions are neutral. This neutrality, of course, is often a charade. Government discretion is to industry what honey is to bears. Do we really believe, for example, that the former chief of staff of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, who was formerly a climate lobbyist with the American Petroleum Institute, do we really believe he was neutral when he edited government climate reports to emphasize doubts about climate change? He then left government to join Exxon. The danger is this: we have relegated climate to the political playing field. There's no umpire on this field. There's just discretion. Citizens now find it normal to have to go lobby government for their own survival. The public has to find a new frame for viewing government's role towards nature. As author George Lakoff says, reframing is changing the way the public sees the world. It is changing what counts as common sense. Let's now look at an ancient yet enduring legal framework designed to hold government accountable. The bedrock principle of this framework is that government is a trustee of our natural assets, including the waters, wildlife, and air. A trust is a fundamental type of legal ownership whereby one manages property for the benefit of another, similar to you managing a college account for your niece. We all hold a common property interest in nature's trust. We, along with future generations, are the rightful beneficiaries of the natural endowment, and we need our trust to be productive in order to sustain human survival and promote human welfare. Our imperiled atmosphere is the most crucial asset in our trust. With every trust, there is a core duty of protection. The trustee must defend the trust against injury. Our government trustees do not have discretion to allow irrevocable damage to our trust. As our Supreme Court said back in 1892, the state can no more abdicate its trust over property in which the whole people are interested than it can abdicate its police powers in the administration of government. This obligation to protect nature's trust lies at the very heart of government's purpose. A government that fails to protect its natural resources sentences its people to misery. When we call upon our government to safeguard our atmosphere, we are invoking principles ingrained in sovereignty itself. These trust principles have been said to exist since the inception of humankind. In this country, nature's trust principles were penned by judges long ago as the first environmental law of this nation. The trust principle underlies all of our modern statutory law. We can take those environmental statutes and, without changing a word of them, reframe government's discretion to destroy nature into an obligation to protect nature. Looking back in the history of this country, reframing was essential to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and FDR's New Deal. When we portray nature as a trust, we vest citizens with expectations of lasting property rights to enduring bounded assets. We start thinking, hey, that's my air, even if I share it with others. Pollution of the air becomes an infringement on American property. The failure to mount a national climate defense is as absurd a proposition as the government sitting idle during an attack on American soil. We can pass any new law we want, however, and no matter what it says, if it is pressed through that discretion frame, the government will continue to impoverish our natural resources until society can no longer sustain itself. Let's look now at how this trust principle finds reinforcement in the economic and moral realms, because a true social paradigm shift must reach well beyond the law. In economic terms, the nature's trust principle finds profound synergy with natural capitalism, which is a fundamental rethinking in economics that requires businesses to build profits by using the Earth's interest, not its capital. When we read about wind power increasing 25% in 1 year alone, that represents a piece of industrial capitalism converting to natural capitalism. Of course, if wind, tidal, geothermal, and solar energy continue to grow, these green industries will snuff out a major part of the fossil fuel industry, as well they should. After all, the heart of American capitalism is innovation and competition. Economic dinosaurs should die and should make way for cleaner industries that won't damage or drain the natural capital that we all rely on. Climate scientists have made clear that humanity cannot release all or even most of the remaining CO2 fossil fuels. In their words, to do so would guarantee dramatic climate change, yielding a different planet than the one on which civilization developed. When we invoke natural capitalism, for the first time ever, we design our economic structure to harmonize with government's timeless duty to protect the assets in our trust. And in moral terms, nature's trust characterizes the natural assets as part of the endowment that future generations are entitled to inherit, just as we inherited them. Failure to protect natural resources amounts to generational theft. The duty towards future generations is a moral imperative that reaches universally to all cultures, all ages, and all classes. This obligation springs from the heart of all humanity. It is this law, not some arcane provision of the Clean Air Act, that provides hope of bringing citizens of the world together to mount a global atmospheric defense effort. Well, within this trust framework, I would now like to offer 3 concrete principles to guide a government's atmospheric response effort. The first principle is that the laws of nature, not politics, must define the necessary action. Scientists have used climate modeling to present us with a path they believe will keep us on the safe side of the tipping point. To achieve the 2°C limit that I told you about earlier, we have to keep atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide below, and maybe very well below, 450 parts per million. We can think of this as the climate imperative. We are presently above 383 parts per million, and we dare not linger there long. You see, this is really just a matter of carbon math. We must realize that if various political measures do not add up to the carbon math in time, they will be futile. A rescue rope that is too short is no good at all. The second principle builds on the first. Trustees have specific fiduciary duties that serve as standards of performance. We don't just vest trustees with priceless assets and have no accountability. If you have $1 million in a retirement account, you wouldn't just say to your banker, oh, you can make 15% or 2% or lose money or even give it away. I'll just take whatever's left. And you certainly wouldn't take this approach with assets that you rely on for survival. The trustee has to measure up to a fiduciary standard of care. So what is the fiduciary standard of care for protecting our atmosphere? In September 2007, the Union of Concerned Scientists issued an emissions target for stabilizing the climate. This is a clear, quantitative prescription for action to get our planet on the path to climate equilibrium, and it is therefore a yardstick for government's fiduciary obligation. There are 3 things the U.S. must do. First, arrest the growth of emissions by 2010. Second, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4% a year thereafter. And 3, achieve 80% reduction by 2050. The deadline to arrest the growth of emissions by 2010 is directly in line with a call by the United Nations to halt worldwide emissions growth by 2015. The worldwide date is set out 5 years farther than the U.S. date because developing nations like China and India will take longer to bring their emissions down. The third principle has to do with the responsibility of each nation and each state within each nation to reduce carbon. The sovereign nations on Earth share the atmosphere as their common property. They are sovereign co-tenant trustees of the atmosphere, all bound by the same duties and obligations that would organize, for example, the relationship of family members who might share a house as co-tenants. Property law has always imposed on co-tenants the duty not to degrade or waste the common asset. You can apply this mandate to every nation on Earth and create a framework for carbon responsibility. You can imagine the world's industrialized planetary carbon share as one big pie. We've heard of pie in the sky. Even though industrialized nations come in different sizes, if each reduces carbon proportionally by the same amount, the carbon pie as a whole will reduce by that amount. But the contrary is also true. If even one major industrialized nation does not accept its share of carbon reduction, does not reduce its slice of the pie will not reduce by the amount it needs to. That country, in other words, leaves an orphan share that will sink all other planetary efforts. The U.S. is responsible for 30% of the carbon pollution on this earth. No other nation is positioned, much less obligated, to accept an orphan share left by a deadbeat sovereign, especially a share as large as ours. So this third principle means that as co-tenant trustees of the atmosphere, the industrialized nations must carry out their share of carbon reduction as set forth in the prescription the scientists have provided. Scaling down to another level, this also means that all states and all cities and counties within every state must carry their burden. It is their fiduciary obligation as trustee. In order to save this planet, we must not excuse any orphan shares of carbon. I recently gave a talk to a class of high school students in McCall, Idaho, and I told them the fate of the entire planet rests on McCall, Idaho. Because if you don't take your share of carbon reduction, who will? Do you expect those of us in Eugene, Oregon to take it? No, we have enough trouble meeting our own carbon reduction obligations. And unless every share is accounted for, we are not going to reduce the carbon pie in the amount we have to in the time we have left. That point hit home with those students. There was a sober moment when they realized that their future depends on their town reducing carbon and on every other town on earth thinking the same way. We must look reality in the eye and ask what it will take to arrest the growth of carbon within 2 years. That is a very short time frame. And yet the hopeful aspect of a society built on waste is that we can make major cuts without compromising any basic needs. We have the legal tools available to arrest the emissions of carbon. A carbon tax, for example, is a swift, effective way to achieve dramatic emissions reductions. Governments should also use moratoria to stop new sources of greenhouse gas emissions. The most urgent moratoria is one against new coal-fired plants. NASA scientist Jim Hansen recently gave testimony in an Iowa coal-fired plant proceeding in which he stated that even one more coal-fired plant with annual emissions of nearly 6 million tons of CO2 per year over 50 years could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We are that close. In addition to curbing emissions, it is imperative to protect the natural resources we still have. We must safeguard any remaining carbon sinks that have the potential to cleanse the atmosphere of our carbon pollution. This means a halt to extractive forestry, wetlands destruction, and industrial farming that destroys soils. Moreover, we have to look at all of our natural resources in a different light because they are now much more valuable to us functioning in their natural way than being used to profit singular interests. Due to the heating already in the pipeline, society is not going to have all of the forests, the wetlands, the waters, and the wildlife that we inherited from prior generations. In the new world of climate heating, all natural resources now carry a premium. Society must now treat nature as if it were more important to our survival than our pocketbooks. And if we can't do that, we have very little hope for the future. We must also start thinking and acting like beneficiaries to hold our government trustees accountable. We must demand government trustees to undertake an accounting and make public these accountings that disclose the results of carbon initiatives. Carbon accountants are now able to measure carbon pollution in any jurisdiction. This means they can track progress in reducing carbon over time. They can track progress in complying with the 4% annual reduction called for by scientists. Without such a carbon accounting, we would have to simply assume that our trustee is doing his job, and no smart beneficiary would do that. As citizens, we are entitled to a carbon accounting as much as we would be entitled to a quarterly statement of our financial assets issued by a bank. Nevertheless, I'll bet many of you are thinking, it's not politically feasible to stop timber sales, sprawling development, and cut back on motorized recreation across the country. And you are quite right. The only politically feasible course of action is to send this world into disaster. Now go look your children in the eye and tell them that. This is why we need courageous leaders to voice a new political paradigm, one that offers real hope to the next generation. But many elected officials make policy out of fear rather than courage. They fear that their constituents will resent measures that cut into their lifestyle. This is exactly backwards. Today's life of convenience will lock us into a future where there is no convenience. Where is the convenience, for example, in a family huddled on top of a roof, waiting for the helicopter to arrive to lift them out of the floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina? Where is the convenience of 500,000 Californians evacuating their homes to escape wildfire racing towards them? Who finds convenience in the death of a 13-year-old boy in Texas who was washed down a flooded creek during the torrential rains? It is time to face the fact that we are living in a different world than we did just 3 years ago. We have to take action now to preserve any semblance of the security that we now take for granted. And those concerned about the impact on private property rights should confront the reality that all private property is secured by natural infrastructure. When that infrastructure collapses, it makes property boundaries irrelevant. Remember, private property deeds didn't account for much in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and they certainly won't account for anything along coastlines inundated by rising sea levels. The choice for government is now disaster prevention or disaster relief. This is a chance for politicians to become true leaders, to explain clearly the nature of the threat and the need for short-term investment and regulation in order to avoid long-term calamity. True leaders know how to do that, and all other leaders must quickly learn how. But we can't walk bravely into this new world without a moral compass to guide us. In World War II, there was a high community standard backing all of the individual sacrifices. You wouldn't have seen an SUV roaring down the streets of America while people were conserving gas to save for the troops. Any waste on the home front was a direct affront to the families that had sent their sons into war. Americans understood the connection between the need to conserve and the welfare of their children whose lives were on the line in defense of our nation. Today we need to recognize the same connection between our waste and the welfare of our children. We must realign our consumption choices between needs versus wants, simplicity versus extravagance. The time has come to ask whether bottled water is more useful for high school vending machines or for disaster relief packages, and whether Hummers are really needed for office commuters. Given what the scientists say, the real hidden subsidy of today's consumptive lifestyle is human death and suffering tomorrow. We are freewheeling over future graves. Barbara Kingsolver speaks of the anguish of standing behind a child, looking with her at the road ahead. She writes, "The truth is so horrific. We are marching ourselves to the maw of our own extinction." In the end, the destiny of our children comes down to actions taken by each one of us individually and all of us collectively. Yes, the problem is big, and yes, it seems insurmountable. But is it too big for you? Should you just turn away from it? Kingsolver says, "I do know the answer to that one. That's called child abuse. When my teenager worries that her generation won't be able to fix this problem, I have to admit to her that it won't be up to her generation. It will be up to mine. This is a now or never kind of project." And she's right. It's now or never collapsed into 2 years to arrest the growth of carbon emissions. Americans must wake up to this reality and hold government responsible for protecting our future. Democracy simply doesn't work without active citizenship. There are many people in this country, perhaps the majority, who are concerned about global warming, but they are taking no action at all to hold their leaders accountable. They are not deniers. They are simply distracted. When these citizens are confronted with the truth of what is going on, they will feel a moral obligation to act, and they will force their leaders to act. This is a psychological leap forward happening all around the world at once, but it doesn't happen without catalysts. Let me tell you about one young catalyst. I mentioned speaking in schools in McCall, Idaho in January. Well, McCall is a small mountain town of about 3,000 people, and it has a tourism and logging, mining and grazing base as well for its economy. And until recently, It was a town that seemed to have no concern for global warming, even though it's been suffering from unusual snowmelt in the winter, raging wildfires in the summer, and a dose of West Nile virus. After I spoke to the McCall High School and Elementary School students, a 10-year-old girl I know named Claire came up to me with a letter that she had written to her community. She wrote it after she and her family watched a movie called Planet in Peril, which documents the cascading loss of ecosystems worldwide. That movie had left her so disturbed and worried about her future that she was moved to write that letter. Well, if I had left town without doing anything about that letter, it would have haunted me. So I told Claire we would get together a group of adults to talk about the letter, and I invited about 20 people, half of whom I didn't even know. And I also invited Peter and Sam, 2 students from the high school I had spoken to, and we got together in a big group. After everyone arrived and filled their plates with food, Claire got up in front of the group and read her letter. And I have with me a 10-year-old elementary student from Eugene, Oregon, who will read a few lines from this letter. His name is Sage.
Dear people of McCall, I am really disappointed not only in what America is doing, but what the whole world is doing. Coral reefs are dying. Forests are becoming farms. Icebergs are melting into the ocean. That is only the start. All the world is getting in trouble. We can make a difference, though. We can make a difference if we just spend time with family and friends, talking over what we can do and proceed to do what we talk about doing.
3 weeks after that letter was read, Peter and Sam, along with their high school class and the adults who had been at that gathering, packed the high school gymnasium with people from the community, hundreds of them, to give a presentation on global warming and how it would affect their future. There were city officials and school officials and coaches and nurses and doctors and grandparents and parents and architects and accountants. The town really turned out. The event began with Claire reading her letter. And there were tears. The people knew this is real. But now there's no stopping that town and the changes they will make. These kids, along with their parents and other community people, have placed responsibility for carbon pollution squarely on McCall, Idaho. And they are taking a leap of faith that cities around the world will do the same thing. 10-year-old Claire is a victory speaker. In World War II, it took 100,000 victory speakers to mobilize the nation in a very short time. We need victory speakers for climate crisis, ordinary citizens that can convey the urgency of the threat and inspire courageous action. Climate victory speakers are emerging from all walks of life. A young Harvard student named Allison Rogers entered the Miss America pageant and put on a swimsuit to draw attention to global warming. A lawyer from England also put on a swimsuit to bring attention to global warming, but he dove into waters in the North Pole, waters that on that day 30 years earlier had been ice 11 feet thick. Author Bill McKibben organized a day of Step It Up rallies across the nation. Laurie David wrote a book. Sheryl Crow did a college tour. Eben Goodstein organized a Focus the Nation event that drew thousands of schools together. University of Montana's Nikki Fear bicycled over 1,000 miles in a ride for climate to bring attention to global warming. A number of nurses are now fighting a coal-fired plant down in Nevada. A 9-year-old boy and his 7-year-old brother here in Eugene, Oregon planted a victory garden to provide free, locally grown produce for their neighborhood. And a 9-year-old Australian boy called Jack Simmons campaigned on YouTube with a stump speech that goes, "So this election, remember, it's your vote, but our future." The world today needs such can-do people, millions of them. We have too many can't-do people, passive bystanders to climate crisis. When their grandchildren demand to know why they did so little at this crucial time, those can't-do people will say, "I didn't know, I didn't have the time. We couldn't control China's emissions. I had too much going on. No one else was doing anything. It wasn't my fault. I couldn't have made a difference." These responses will be ashes in the wind. The can-do people will save this planet, and they will tell their grandchildren how they answered the call of a generational mission. There are can-do people in every corner of the globe. Whatever your position is in life, do something, do anything, just don't do nothing. If you are a teacher, bring global warming to the classroom. If you are a parent, bring it to the PTA. If you are a lawyer, bring global warming to court. And if you are a businessman, bring global warming to the bank. Somehow fate has delivered us all into this pivotal moment on Earth. We were not here 100 years ago when it was too early to even imagine the collapse upon us. And we will not be here 100 years from now when it will be too late to save what we still can. We can only claim our moment. But if we Americans take the lead through all these walks of life, we can reframe what is currently government's discretion to destroy our atmosphere into an obligation to protect our atmosphere as an asset in the endowment that we must hand down to our children for their survival. If we succeed in defining that one obligation on the part of our government, we may soon find every other nation on Earth joining with us, not against us, in a massive effort to secure the systems of life on Earth for all generations to come. When that dawn unfolds, victory speakers around the world will know this, that during our moment, we ignited planetary patriotism. Thank you.